I do come from the engineering side of the business, so if I do get into anything that I get too excited about, but is making no sense at all, please feel free to let me know by just kind of nodding off and falling asleep, and I will try and pick up the pace a bit for you. So first of all, just a quick show of hands so I sort of know how to pace things. Who has, outside of Tim's introduction, heard of AMP before? Oh, okay, good. You guys prepared for this. Okay, that's heartening. And who would consider themselves a web developer? Oh, okay, good, good. You have justified a number of the slides that I have in this presentation, so I feel happy about where I've pitched this. So firstly, a little bit about me. Well, more like when we run out of time, because I have way too many slides. If you want to find me on Twitter afterwards, please look for Rowan M. I'm also on Google+, if you're there. And you can find me on GitHub as well if you're interested in the code side of this. I wanted to talk a little bit then about where AMP is positioned in the kind of the ecosystem of the web. The web was kind of where I started programming. Simply because it's so accessible. So there is almost no barrier to entry for building a website. If you have a text editor and an internet connection, then you can fill the internet with your valuable opinions to share with the rest of the world. And so we initially started with this kind of level of web page. So you can see that kind of, you've basically got some high definition graphics there, and a form that you can fill in, and a button that you can press. So this is what Google looked like in its very first iteration. However, the first iteration of sites that a lot of people made, including myself, actually looked a bit more like this. So this was my kind of discovery when you found that you could put animated GIFs everywhere, and maybe an auto-playing MIDI file as well to provide some ambient background music for people. And the problem was that this is a lot of fun to create, but it doesn't necessarily make for a good experience. And this may have been the state of play in 1997, and the problem is that we haven't necessarily really moved on from that. People have found more expensive and heavier ways of doing a lot of the same things. So the average mobile page these days is this: 214 requests, of which half of them tend to be ad-related, with an average 19 seconds page load time. And so that means that 70% of those sites are taking over 10 seconds to load. And I'm sure that you've seen the stats around what page load time does to visitor interaction, the amount of money that you are losing the longer the page takes to load, just based on the number of people who are simply going to give up. And so what we want to try and do is we really want to be aiming for that 3-second mark, which is a pretty large chunk of time that we need to cut off of this to make this happen. So this is kind of setting the scene for what we viewed as a problem with the web as it stood. And specifically when we started this, we started looking at news publishers first. Because a lot of news sites were a very bad experience for users who simply wanted to read an article and not be bombarded with animated adverts or videos or slow loading connections or content that moved around while you're trying to tap on a particular image. So first, I'll set the scene with this little brain teaser for you. This is kind of how we describe an AMP document. So what I need you to do is try and understand what this means, but also keep it in the back of your head as we go through the rest of the presentation. So AMP documents are just HTML. So if you're thinking about what do I need to spin up in terms of a team or expertise in order to create my AMP pages, then it is just your existing web development team. They will be able to do this. But what AMP provides is a tighter set of valid criteria for those pages. So your developers will have a very clear set of guidelines and automatic validation to tell them whether they have created a valid AMP document. And that's what allows us to make this guarantee that the document will only be valid if certain things that we know have the potential to slow the page down are excluded. Okay, so perhaps a metaphor that is slightly easier for this time in the morning. If this is the state of the modern web, then all of those snail pages that we looked at before are at the back of the pack here. Now what you can do, though, is AMP is not a magic bullet. It's not going to solve all your problems, and because it is very focused on speed as well, it means that there are a number of things that are not possible to do inside of AMP. So if you have the expertise, and you have the development team, and you have the time, then you will always be able to create a faster hand-tuned site. But what AMP will allow you to do is get 80% of the way there with very little effort. So how do we do that, then? AMP is effectively built on these pillars to try and sort of give you an idea of where the technology is headed and the ethos behind the project as well. So what we wanted to do was, above all, we wanted to make sure that it was fast. So this is always the overriding factor in every single AMP decision. Is this going to be a high-performing component and a high-performing page? Next, we wanted to make sure that we didn't lose that beauty of kind of, if you have a text editor and an internet connection, you can create a web page, you can also create AMP. A really big key for us is that it was mobile friendly. Interestingly, in the name, so the name does stand for Accelerated Mobile Pages, but that is much more of a kind of brand than a technical limitation. You can absolutely deliver AMP on the desktop as well. It's just that the browsing experience tends not to be as constrained by low-performing devices and low bandwidth connections. Secondly, we wanted to embrace the open web as well. So it's important to remember that AMP, whilst a Google-initiated project, is an open source initiative. So it's got contributors from all over the web, and various other people are building AMP into their products. So for example, Bing will surface AMP results when you search for something. And I'll show you a few more examples as we go through this as well. And then finally, what we also wanted to make sure is that you are still able to make money when you create AMP pages. So we wanted to get around the whole kind of idea of a lot of the reasons that people will do something like block an ad is because the ads are creating a terrible experience for them on the page. They're slowing down the load, they're popping in inconvenient places. So it's not necessarily that the advertising is a problem for them, it's the experience that it gives them. So we wanted to make sure that you can still provide a monetization experience inside of AMP. You can just do it in a way that doesn't also annoy your user. Okay, the main components then. And this is where I will say I'm going to put some code up. So if that is going to be too difficult for this time in the morning, feel free to look away or just scream and run out of the room. The three main components of AMP then. The HTML format. So this is what your developers or you will be writing in your document. Then AMP.js, which is the library that we provide that converts those documents into the actual pages that are being displayed. And then the final component, which is the Google AMP cache. So this sits off to the side, which is where we actually serve your AMP documents from. So just to give you a little idea of what's involved in this. And the other thing I'll say is I am going to go through this relatively quickly, but I am around afterwards, so if you want to find me and talk to me about the details of any implementation or dive more into the samples that I've got here, then I'm happy to cover that in more detail afterwards. So just to give you an idea, this is what is involved in writing an AMP page. So if you're familiar with HTML, then this should be very familiar to you. You start with just your opening definition, where we add a little lightning bolt, or you can just type AMP in there as well. And this is what is going to indicate to the browser and to the library that it's processing an AMP document. And then here, this is how we make your AMP documents visible to the clients that want to consume them. So like the crawler, when it's indexing your site, AMP is handled in exactly the same way as you might already handle different translations for content on your site. So you probably have a canonical version of your content, which may be, say, like the /product.html, which would be in English. Then you might have, say, /de/product for your German version. And this would be linked in a link rel tag. So it is very important that when you have a strategy as to how you're going to build out AMP, you decide whether you are presenting AMP as the default version of the product, as the page, or whether you're presenting it as an alternate version of the page. And this will inform how you go about linking up your HTML content and your AMP content. Then we have this little bit. So feel free to ignore this. This is just the boilerplate that AMP requires to do some of the high-performance magic that just sits in each of the pages. Then this is the bit where you are pulling in the JavaScript runtime that is going to transform the page. This is served off of our CDN. So what this also means is that if a user has visited another AMP page in the past, they are likely to have this cached already. So again, the overhead for doing an AMP page is continually being driven down by the wider adoption. And then finally, you get to write some content. And this is literally just whatever HTML content you want to write in there. The AMP.js runtime then provides a number of performance optimizations for you. What it enables is it means that the resources on your page are managed by the runtime and loaded in an efficient and responsive way. So all images by default are going to be lazy loaded. Any iframes that you put in are going to be loaded at a slightly lower priority than the main content. And it also provides the transformations for the web components that make up the AMP HTML. And then the final piece of this puzzle is the AMP cache. So the way I wanted to describe this is using an enterprise architecture diagram. You can tell it's enterprise because there is a cloud here. So this is how we know we're talking about a large-scale system. But effectively what you have is the initial solution over here, which is serving directly off of your own server to individual users, or if you already have a CDN or some kind of similar setup, then you'll be familiar with the benefits of serving through a cache. And the other aspects that we enable through the cache is regardless of what your site is served on, so whether it's HTTP or HTTPS, whether it's just using HTTP1 or not updated to HTTP2, by proxying it through our cache, we're able to enable HTTP2 for you, which gives you another performance boost. We're also able to make sure that you are HTTPS by default. So it means that a number of the features that are available in your browsers, which are restricted to HTTPS only, are always going to be available in your site. So if one of the issues that you have with, say, updating your web stack is migrating to a sort of a newer infrastructure to enable some of these technologies, serving through the AMP cache gives you a kind of shortcut for accessing some of those benefits without having to implement them on your own infrastructure. Okay, but given all of that, why is AMP fast? These are the optimizations that are happening for you in the background. The reason I wanted to show you this slide as well is because outside of AMP, these are actually things to think about. These are just general high-performance tips for building on the modern web. So you'll see that the async scripts, what this means is that all the resources on the page are loaded when the browser has time to do it. They are not going to block the content appearing on the page. So the user will always have the content first, and then the richer functionality comes in as and when it's ready. We also do some interesting things with the way we size the resources. This means that we are able to do some pre-rendering of that content for the user as well, to make it seem like it's actually loaded in a very instant fashion. I don't want to go too much into the other bits, but basically these are a number of optimizations that are provided to prevent some of the practices that can hurt your performance, and also give you this kind of automatic access to a number of the things that enable a lot higher performing web page. And what I wanted to give you an idea of what that means in practice is if you imagine your page here, So you probably have some kind of hero image at the top. You've got maybe your headline. This is actually based off of a Guardian article for one of the initial templates they did. And what happens in here is that the runtime is responsible for ensuring that it's only that initial viewport that gets downloaded first. And by doing that, what we're also able to do in the search results is we can pre-render that as well. So when the user, say, searches for a particular product and they see a result at the top, which is AMP, and they tap on that, in the background, we will have already fetched and rendered that result. So the effect for the user is that when they tap, they get this immediate load of the page there. There's no waiting for the actual response time for your server to generate that page. This is something as well that you can make use of in your own site, but you should also be careful with it, because one of the things that is a possibility to suddenly say, well, actually, we could just pre-render everything, right? When you land on the front page, we could just then go and fetch every single other product that's linked from there. And anyone who does not have an unlimited data allowance is not going to thank you for that kind of optimization. So, a couple of the things that we're trying to fix with this then. One of the effects that you may have seen before is that you are browsing the internet and you have found a picture of a cat. This is a cat that used to live down the road from me, so obviously I took a picture of it, and I imagine what you would like to do at this stage is you would like to tap on that image because you would like to see this cat, much larger in all its glory, and maybe even leave me a comment on Instagram telling me how amazing this picture is. And you're just about to do that when an ad pops in, and instead of being able to tap on the cat, there's an ad about dogs there, and you get this. So this is what we are preventing with the static layout and the resource sizing, is it means that it is not possible for ads to pop in to their location. They always have a space reserved for them, and they fill that in as they go. So AMP has actually been out in the wild now for 2 years, and we've been including it in search results for a year. So I wanted to show you a couple of the places that you can go if you want to produce AMP and some of the people who are consuming it. So Pinterest is a very interesting example. If you find some content on the web that has an AMP version, and then you pin that in the Pinterest app and you look at it in the iOS version of the Pinterest app, then what you will see is Pinterest actually serving the AMP content for that pin. This is very interesting because the original sort of internal name that we had for AMP was portable content units. The idea that what we're doing by making this stuff cached and high performance is we're providing a way for you to package up and then syndicate your content out across all of these different apps, all of these different networks. So if you have something like a particular product info card or a particular promotion page, then by creating AMP content for it, what you're really doing is you're kind of packaging that up in a way that you're saying, what I want is other apps to be able to take this and present my content in a very high-performing way, but in a way that also means that you retain the control over it, and you still have access to the monetization, the tracking, all of the things that you would if it was hosted on your own page. I think one of the benefits of this is that I saw a study recently where people were finding that rather than using, say, the share functionality that people have built into their sites or into their apps, what everybody does now is they just take a screenshot and then they send that to their friends in a messenger. And what this means is that people are bypassing the experience that has been built for them because it's clunky and slow, and it means that you have no way of understanding where this content has gone, how people are interacting with it. So what we're hoping with AMP is that this gives you some more control back over that content and makes it a lot easier for people to distribute it, which they were going to go ahead and do anyway. A few other examples here. Has anyone created a moment on Twitter? Oh, so I guess you guys aren't really tweeting a lot either. Oh, has anyone consumed a moment on Twitter? Really? Has everyone fallen asleep? Okay. So Twitter does this with their moments, which are kind of like their rich stories that you can consume. Again, if there is AMP content available, then that is what Twitter will produce in the story. And then you also have a number of platforms. So WordPress has an AMP theme that you can simply apply to your existing blog. So if you want to experiment with AMP and you already have a WordPress blog, then you can just enable that theme to see what the default version of that would happen. I also wanted to show you a couple options, a couple examples of people who are doing this in this vertical as well. So Eventbrite have actually started producing AMP content as well. And what this means is if you do a Google search, so if you have data or the Wi-Fi is working for you, then you can try this out. If you search for Eventbrite Internet Retail Expo, you'll get the expected results page. And if you scroll down a bit, then you can see there the AMP badge against the results. And what happens is you can actually compare this to tapping on other links as well. But if you tap that, you will get this immediate load of the AMP content. And what you can try as well is you will see that visually people have taken the approach of making sure that as far as the user is concerned, the user doesn't care that they're seeing AMP content versus web content as long as it's fast. So what that means is you do want to be careful of making sure that the transition from AMP content that you create to web content still maintains the same visual look and doesn't provide a jarring experience for the user. eBay has been doing this. eBay has actually been doing this for quite a long time. So what they have done is if you search for something, so in this case, I'm searching for Jimmy Choo and eBay, then you'll see that the categories in there all have AMP results in them. If you tap onto that, then again, you'll get this very quick, near instant load. And you can see that eBay is still providing quite a rich mobile page. If you compare this to their current mobile web page, they are almost identical. AMP still enables you to have sort of swipeable carousels of images and a lot of interactive functionality that I find often people come with this conception that AMP is about static content, which means that you're limited in terms of animation, interactivity, transformations. There are a lot of components that actually give you this rich functionality in there just in a high-performing way. So you can actually try it if you then tap around and tap out to another part of the site. You're actually moving off of the AMP content onto eBay's site. But the transition as a user is very seamless because the same kind of functionality is provided on both. Okay, what am I suggesting that you should go out and do then? We have created ampstart.com. This is basically a site that provides some templates for you. So if you want to see what's possible with AMP and what your designers can get up to, then AmpStart gives you, unsurprisingly, some starting points to do that. We've also then built out ampbyexample.com. So if you want to see the sheer range of components that are available, we've made those available on ampbyexample.com, and we've also provided some vertical-specific samples on there. And you can, rather than always just bugging me about this, you can also bug my colleagues on Twitter who sit next to me in London and are responsible for the bulk of this site. So this is what it looks like. You can see that it's using the AmpStart templates as the way of building this out. I wanted to highlight a few key components for you then. One of the ways that you can fail with an AMP strategy is if you simply try and visually reproduce the page and then just push that live and get going with it. So actually, I had forgotten. I wanted to show you the product sample first because that's presumably fairly relevant to you here. So this is on ampbyexample.com. You can go down to the samples and templates, and this is one of the vertical specific ones we do. So we have a product category page here where this is an animated carousel at the top, so this will auto-advance through the hero images. We're pulling in a product list here, and what this highlights is that whilst some of this content is static, as in it is served initially in the page, we also have a number of APIs that you can access. So if you want to do something like products recommended for you, or users who bought this also bought that, then you can make JSON calls that will not be cached in the page, but will allow you to load dynamic content into the AMP page as well. So you can see here, if I then tap through to one of the products, then this actually gives me like a fairly standard product selection page. This is actually using one of the experimental components, which we call AMP bind. And this is what gives you the ability to tap on the individual, say, colors. And when I select a different color, I can change the hero image. I can change the availability of the sizes and so on. And what I wanted to do is this highlights this also highlights how you can get involved in the process. So what I would very much recommend is building out some of these components. And when you find areas that aren't working for you, then you can actually, we have an e-commerce working group where we have a number of major e-commerce players who are sitting down with the development team on a monthly basis to go through the roadmap, to give feedback on the components, and to explain how performance is going for them. So we're very keen for this to be effective for you, which means that if there's stuff that isn't working, you can just talk directly to the team to get the roadmap to start moving in a direction that will work for you. So I wanted to finish with a couple more real-world examples. Boxed is a sort of wholesale retailer who does this. So again, if you were to search for, I think, what did I search for here? Instant coffee, yes, because that is what I actually need in about 5 minutes. So if you search on that, again, you get to what looks like a very standard product info page, all built in AMP. And then when you tap onto anything else, so an important thing you can see here is this is being served from our cache. The user has the indication of that with the box.com and the link at the top. When they tap on anything in there, they're now actually off of the Google cache and onto the box.com site, but they've ensured that this journey is very smooth. So the three sort of key components that you definitely want to pay attention to that are not necessarily visual inside of AMP. One, if you do all of this and publish it, but don't measure it, then you're not going to know if this was a good idea or not. So there is an AMP analytics component that you can use. This supports a number of existing analytics providers. I think we're well over 30 at the moment. But you can also send that analytics data to an arbitrary endpoint as well. So if you have your own in-house BI system, then you can pass AMP data directly to that. Also, if the page loads and it doesn't make any money, then this has also been a bad idea for you. So the other thing we have is the AMP ad format. So if you are advertising on other sites, you can be included in AMP content if you are publishing ads there. And likewise, you can include ads on your AMP content. I would especially recommend, if you are looking at AMP by example on your phone at the moment, there is an AMP flying carpet tag, which uses the ad format where you have a static image in the background, and you can slide the page up and down, and you can see the image sliding behind it. I perhaps get a little more excited about these things than most people do, but it's fun if the speaker is boring you at the time. And then the final component I wanted to say, and this is kind of the journey into the wider modern web as well, is I like to think of AMP as the front door that your users can encounter when they are coming to your site, either through search or through shared links or through another app. So what you can do with AMP is you can provide this very fast initial experience, which if you are in a competitive industry, then you will know that if a user doesn't get what they want in the first second of that result, they're just going to click back and they're going to go to the next one. One of the things you can do then is, so who has heard of service workers? One. Okay, so a service worker is a piece of JavaScript that can actually live in the browser and do work for your site even when your site is not loaded. This starts to open up all kinds of interesting things, like your site being able to function when the user is offline, your site being able to receive and display push notifications without having any app installed. And so what we can do is AMP can install a service worker, and that means that in your AMP page, you have a very fast experience, but you want the user to move on to a richer experience afterwards, the service worker can be responsible for warming up the cache so that when the user does want to go to the next step, they get an immediate feeling as well, so they don't sort of drop off a cliff of user experience. So I just wanted to leave you with this. It would be great for you to go out and experiment with the format. If you have already, please come tell me about how that worked out for you. I have a number of strategies that you can also use if you want to try A/B testing this to see how effective it is in the wild. Yeah, and then publish it and hopefully see an increase in metrics you care about from having these faster pages. So thank you. I think we've got time for a few questions.
Thanks, Rowan. Thanks for that great intro and very then detailed exposition of what AMP is. Everybody, thank you to Rowan.